Hi, everybody. Welcome to our fireside chat on cross-border information sharing, unlocking business opportunities while mitigating privacy risk. This is no doubt a complex topic, so I'm really excited to have 5 subject matter experts on this panel today to discuss legal and regulatory aspects, new business opportunities, and technical solutions to support compliant cross-border data sharing. I would like to remind you that we'll have an audience Q&A at the end of the panel discussions, so you can submit your questions through the Q&A function. Before we start our panel, I'd just like to do a quick poll. So the first question is, to what extent is cross-border information sharing a challenge for your business? And the second question is, what benefits would your organization gain from better cross-border information sharing? Okay, so not very surprisingly, the majority of you thinks that cross-border information sharing is a serious challenge. And the benefits your organization could gain is risk reduction, first and foremost. Then we have enhanced customer experience and at the same level as cost savings and revenue generations. And none of these. All right. Thank you, everybody. This has been insightful. So now I'm going to hand over to Nick, our moderator. Please introduce yourself, Nick, and take it from here.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Duality for organizing today. I'm Nick Maxwell. I'm the head of the Future of Financial Intelligence Sharing Research Program within RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. We've got a packed agenda today, and we know that these events are watched because I attended a FATF high-level roundtable a month or so after the last one, and it was referenced multiple times. So this is where the discussion is that's shaping debate, which is great. So if that poll result didn't give us the full understanding of challenges here, we're going to start off really with experts who can help us understand that. So Jeanette Gunderson, Head of Data Sharing, Access and Privacy, HSBC's compliance function, and Sarah Runge, Global Head of Financial Crimes Compliance and Regulatory Strategy at Credit Suisse. So, from that perspective, from international banks, can you help us understand, what are these challenges from your organization's perspective with regard to cross-border information sharing, and how is it having a negative result impact on your ability to manage risk? Perhaps Jeanette, you could start us off.
Sure, happy to, Nick. For those having a bit of a flashback, yes, Sarah and I worked together at the Treasury Department. You may have seen us on other panels in other contexts before. But in this context, we're talking about cross-border information sharing within global financial institutions that are trying to manage financial crime risk across the world. So we're having increasing challenges in sharing that data all the way across our different institutions' global footprints, especially for me and my institution. We're in more than 60 markets. It creates quite a bit of challenge because we have to comply with the law in each one of those markets. The data privacy laws are different. We have our own regulatory financial crime obligations, and we have to satisfy all of those. So the real operational challenges where the rubber hits the road here are that you have to be able to identify what laws apply in what circumstance with the sharing that you're trying to engage in. So what can you be sharing in each instance? And how do you create a framework that allows your teams doing financial crime and regulatory compliance work to be focused in their areas of expertise? Be confident in sharing data, but not have to become data sharing experts. So whenever we have those challenges and we encounter areas where we can't share data, of course, you always have the operational problem that you have created a knowledge gap. Because if we can't share, financial crime is generally transnational now. Our sophisticated criminals that we're really combating in major international crime, they know about this issue. They take advantage of the fact that we can't share data. So where we can't share, we have a knowledge gap, and we have blind spots where we're not able to identify financial crime. As financial institutions, we're really we're the coal face, we're in the front line of seeing where financial crime starts, because we're the place where people go to start their financial crime journey. We don't want to be the place where they start that financial crime journey, but when you can only see one side of the transaction, sometimes it's very hard to tell what is suspicious and what is not. So what I've seen is that as a financial institution, we've had to create all sorts of control systems and support mechanisms to try and make sure that we're educating our users and protecting our users who might not be experts in this area, so they can share data where we can, but they don't where they cannot. In the end, though, we have a challenge where I'm hoping, Ronan, you're going to help us solve this problem, where we can try and share data without necessarily sharing identity information, which can help identify financial crime. But it's fascinating because in the end, someone needs to know who did it to hold someone responsible and to take final action. And that's one of our big barriers. And this is this sort of move toward that some of us have seen towards data localization globally, where we have markets that are really moving towards, no, you need to be hosting the data in country. You perhaps cannot share certain kinds of data for certain markets. Some countries have a long history of banking secrecy and are quite averse to changing that history. How do we move forward with the world that we have now, that is an interconnected global financial crime and financial system? Really, it's a financial system our financial criminals take advantage of to the harm of our communities. But if we can solve some of these problems, I think when we're able to share data, we're able to find more financial crime. That doesn't just save some people money, it does a lot of good for our communities. These aren't just, when you think of money laundering, a lot of times people think of, sophisticated criminals in suits and sort of a white collar, perhaps even victimless crime, but that's not really what happens here. You're diverting money from legitimate business. You're looking at the proceeds of corruption in some places. You're looking at things like human trafficking and fraud proceeds. So being able to identify this is really important, I think, to protecting our communities all around the world, and to being able to support there being good access to financial services for a broad array of customers. But Sarah, what have you seen as terms of challenges at your institution? I'd love to hear more about it.
And perhaps that whole suite, FATF have tried to emphasize that intra-group sharing across borders should be permitted by governments, but we're seeing that disconnect in terms of the policy environment not actually being there to provide that certainty. What does that look like from your perspective, Sarah? How are you addressing those challenges currently? And what's the benefit if we can move forward on this?
Yeah, look, I think of these issues as tactical and strategic in terms of how we're trying to address them within the firm. And, I think Jeanette has very clearly outlined how complicated this is, and as a result, how much time financial institutions spend in order to ensure that we're not breaking any laws as it relates to data sharing. Nick, as you say, FATF has tried to make clear, and there is a clear requirement for financial institutions to share information enterprise-wide. And the whole purpose of this is for risk management. And when I think of it from tactical, very practical perspective, we just want to know where our clients are operating and what products and services they're using across our firm globally. And we can't do that very easily. Very, very challenging. And the extent that we do it, we jump through the hoops that Jeanette has articulated. Within Credit Suisse, we have developed something called Single Client View, which will be a data source of all our client information, that will provide us with that capacity. But just to sort of pick up on some very simple points here, Nick, quickly. At the end of the day, what this comes down to is that if we have a client that we determine for risk reasons needs to be off-boarded in one jurisdiction, how is that communicated globally? How do we communicate that in a way that is within the legal bounds related to data privacy, while also meeting the obligations that FATF has laid out and our supervisors have laid out? And I think that is the fundamental challenge that we are all trying to overcome, because we all want us to do that. but it's not always clear that I think the barriers and the need to share, which is exactly what Jeanette's job is. I mean, the extent that we do share is in the capacity of the appropriate circumstance, but that is very time consuming and very costly.
And can you give us an example of, on a practical basis, examples where you're being torn in opposite directions, being compelled to try and share and get the information to understand risk, but then being prevented to do so by another jurisdiction's approach? Are there some examples that can give color to this?
Oh, all of them. I mean, very honestly, because at the end of the day, I mean, so Credit Suisse is obviously a Swiss headquartered financial institution. We are permitted to share information with Switzerland. We do that. It can only be known in Switzerland, right? So the extent to which there's a need for anyone else to know, they would have to be in Switzerland in order to have that. And we are looking at ways to provide that. But that's a good example. Within the US context, for example, there's a very clear expectations. We hear it repeatedly from our supervisor that we need to have a global view. I'm not always sure though, and this kind of gets to the challenge around the FATF and others, that they fully understand, because they don't sit in the data privacy world, right? So they don't fully understand what those legal barriers are. And I think that's the fundamental disconnect. So information, to answer your question, can travel some directions, but not in others. It can be collated in some places, but not in others. And I think institutions have been developing different hub and spoke models globally in order to find ways to share appropriately, to manage risk, but not cross any other legal barriers or other legal lines.
I think following on from that, Sarah, your US example is a very good one, because the US restrictions on sharing information about a particular SAR filing are a great example. The US regulators are very clear that they want us to be sharing information enterprise-wide to assess customer risk, but are also very clear that until they pass the recent law that said that there can be a pilot program about affiliate SAR sharing at the end of last year, you were not allowed to disclose outside your direct parent chain of ownership whether a certain SAR had been filed.
But to make that even a finer point on that, I think it's such an important point, is that foreign banking organizations could share out. So CS is legally permitted to share out. US headquartered institutions could not. So the question is, why is that? Why, where is that disconnect? Anyway, so I don't know the answer to that question.
No, really, really helpful and great to get that, kind of on the ground perspective of those, not just frustrations, but as Jeanette, you very powerfully set out, this is undermining the ability to protect society at large from some of the most serious and organized crime, heinous crime out there, very damaging to individuals, vulnerable or otherwise. So thank you very much for explaining that. And you touched on some really interesting points about policy and the fact that the recent US reforms potentially alleviate some of those challenges. Just in the last few minutes of this opening segment, are there other good examples out there? We're going to talk about technology in a moment, but where you see good practice for cross-border information sharing?
I mean, I'll start. I'm sure Jeanette hasn't. Look, I actually think the cross-border piece is the hardest piece of this. And although I will say that domestic pieces are also a big issue, right? So very few jurisdictions, the US being the only one, I think from a legal provisions standpoint, the UK is moving towards this, where financial institutions within one jurisdiction can share one information legally with one another. So if we think about how challenging that is, take that to a cross-border level, right? And if we within an institution can't do it, what is our capacity to do that in a more meaningful way? As a lot of, and Nick, I mean, this is the basis of everything you're doing, right? I mean, how is it that we then can overcome those barriers? So I must say, from a cross-border perspective, outside of one group, which is challenging enough, I'm not familiar with any real success stories, unfortunately. And Nick, you probably are. I know you're trying to operate some, but I think that is the biggest.
I think there's some examples that we could perhaps learn from some of the public-private information partnerships, and then with some of the fraud reporting that we've got here in the UK, right? So we've established the organization whose name always slips my mind, I apologize, to compile fraud data. And bring
FFIS, I believe.
FFIS, yes.
And there
exactly.
are others out there as well. I think Synectics and the Insurance Fraud Bureau. There's quite a lively space, I think, in the UK.
And that's, I think, a great example of bringing together data from different institutions to identify real fraud risk and also to really support your customers and the victims. So you can identify people that have been the victims of fraud so that it has a less of an impact on their lives as they try to go about their normal financial existence. We've also got things like the 314B program in the United States and the GIMLET here in the UK, where for specific projects, you can bring the private sector and some public sector law enforcement teams together to identify issues or information related to or relevant to certain issues without it having to be a full-scale subpoena, grand jury sort of exercise. So those are some interesting ones, but what's interesting there, I think, is that there are some very specific legal parameters in place that reduce the data sharing issues that we have. So it's very clear that the data privacy laws, well, they certainly continue to apply, especially here in the UK, that you have the legal authorization to be sharing under those programs. So you have a clarity that allows us to act in a way that we might not be able to act in other circumstances.
Fantastic. Well, I think that sets us up really well to understand the practical challenges and this policy complexity with, huge value and need to share to understand the underlying financial crime risk, but a lot of prohibitions, a lot of challenges in law. Ronan, from your perspective, head of product marketing and product strategy at Duality Technologies, what opportunities are there from a technical perspective to perhaps alleviate some of these challenges?
Thanks for the question, Nick. As a response to a lot of the challenges that Sarah and Jeanette have brought up, for example, the tension between laws across borders or even laws across functional areas like privacy and financial crime, there's a whole category of new technology that has emerged called privacy enhancing technology, which are meant to enable users to leverage their data while preserving privacy, confidentiality, regulatory compliance, you name it. And you may have heard of some of them, like multi-party computation or differential privacy and homomorphic encryption. And these are all basically like tools in a toolbox. Each one is best suited for a different purpose, different use cases. One in particular that is gaining traction that I can, of course, speak to is homomorphic encryption, which enables you to encrypt data in use. So it actually means that you can encrypt data and still use it, still compute on it, anything from simple statistics all the way through AI and machine learning without ever decrypting it. And what that tactically allows you to do is organizations can collaborate across borders or across companies without exposing sensitive data. And it fits a variety of collaboration models that I think Jeanette and Sarah touched upon. One would be, for example, pooling encrypted data in one place and analyzing it. So sort of a hub and spoke where the data is all in one place. But interestingly, it also enables decentralized collaboration, where the data doesn't need to move at all, but you can still get insights. So what you're sharing in that case isn't the data itself, but it's the answers, right, that you're really looking for example, in investigations and so on. And both can be really useful for cross-border information sharing. And I think just to touch on the second part of your question, when it comes to data privacy regulation specifically and how these sort of technologies fit in, many experts have found that homomorphic encryption specifically supports compliance with privacy regulations like CCPA and GDPR and even others like HIPAA, for example, because they found that data that is encrypted and analyzed using certain types of this encryption do not meet the definition of PII under those laws. So that means that organizations can actually work each other and ensure no one's being exposed to anything. And we're actually even seeing regulators stepping out in support of it, like the AEPD in Spain, IPC in Canada, and so on. So I think this is sort of a building inertia and momentum in terms of these solutions. None are a silver bullet, but they can certainly be helpful, particularly in specific use cases.
And then, briefly, what do you see as the real challenges around this technology? You refer to the legal environment, but there are obviously still legal uncertainties about if computations are derived from personal data, at what point does that present a legal risk under certain privacy regimes such as GDPR? And what other challenges do you see for the growth of the technology?
Sure. I think there's probably two that I would highlight. One is regulatory and legal, as you said. The other is actually more about the public perception and understanding of these types of emerging technologies, which everyone is encountering. From a regulatory perspective, I would say that the largest challenge is unclear and unharmonized regulations concerning data privacy across borders, as well as a tension in regulations across functional area. The classic example is data privacy laws tell you to keep the data private. AML and counterterrorism laws tell you need to investigate it. So how do you reconcile the two? And this is an area, I think we'll get into this later, but closer collaboration and harmonization across regulators and across borders would be incredibly valuable. And we're actually seeing a move towards this. So bodies like the European Data Protection Board, EU Commission, and even FATF have issued a series of conversations, requests for comments, roundtables around this. So I think that's one set. The other set is the technology itself and misconceptions around readiness and maturity for privacy enhancing technologies in general. There have historically been concerns around things like performance, what types of computations can be supported and conducted, and how that all fits into privacy. And people in the media still incorrectly believe that it's not ready. But users of this technology in financial crime, for instance, can today expect to collaborate across borders and organizations and get insights to questions in seconds. Whereas under current processes, for example, Jeanette brought up 314B, it could take several months. I think another telling example is actually in the world of healthcare. It's just, I think, something everyone can wrap their heads around. We actually recently released a study conducted with Harvard's Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where they used our technology to analyze the DNA of tens of thousands of individuals to understand which genes might affect certain types of cancers. So you can imagine the sensitivity around that data. Not only did they find that they can protect the privacy, but they found that they can do these analyses 30 times faster than any other secure computing method that exists. So I really think that these sorts of public benchmarks and public information help to dispel the myth around performance, maturity, and readiness. And hopefully we can sort of get over that hump, and the regulatory piece will follow too.
Yeah, and it's a big concept for people to get their heads around, that you can collaborate on computational results, but you don't have to share any underlying data, and that underlying data would be undisclosed. And it's almost as if our language doesn't help us to articulate that act, because sharing or collaboration, even analysis, can conjure up different thoughts and risks of the process, which perhaps the technology can respond to. So that's just the kind of cultural and the leadership level engagement that you've mentioned there in the technology, Ronan. Odia, from your perspective, from the hard letter of the law, Odia Kagan, partner and chair of GDPR compliance and international privacy at Fox Rothschilds LLP. From your perspective, how do you see the law interacting with, both obviously these challenges, but the technical developments that Ronan's identified?
Not well. I see it interacting not well. I think that the issue, basically, kind of to follow up on what everybody was saying. So we have the data protection laws. They are either old, semi-old, or potentially written by people that have not dealt with the actual, actual sharing and the actual tech. So that always creates a problem, number one. The point of the laws is to, GDPR, right? The stated purpose is to encourage the free flow of data, right? But it does so by limiting the flow of data, and it conflicts, right, with the AML laws and some of the financial regulatory laws that want to encourage the sharing, right? So they don't match, right? They don't match, and there needs to be some sort of the equivalent, legal thing of, when you go to the UK and you guys have that strange electric outlet adapter thingy. So there needs
I have to come in at you there, Odia. That is the most, I have traveled all around the world, and that is the best plug socket anywhere.
The
I'll stop
best.
there.
But
Back to you.
ours are deficient, right? Like the US one is deficient or whatever, but they don't match is the point, right? Like you come and your laptop does not go into the wall, right? Your laptop wants to share data, your wall wants to give electricity, they don't match, right? So they need to match. And the only way to really do this is to do something, right? And the example, there's a couple of things. First of all, Renan was saying about the, sharing without sharing. And that kind of works actually with the US approach for de-identification, which is a little bit, less maybe specific than GDPR. For GDPR, I think, and I don't know the depth of the technology, but I think it's very difficult to get to pass this pseudonymization concept, right? Because GDPR, if like you have the key somewhere and you can, by telepathy maybe get to it or something, it could be pseudonymous data, right? And the issue, and that may be fine, right? But then I think there needs to be some sort of, guidance that says, okay, yeah, it's pseudonymous data, but pseudonymous data carries with it a way, way, way lower risk. And here's the reward, and here is what we need to do. And it's not impossible to do it. I'm going to give an example, which is a little bit different, but is something that literally happened a few days ago and seems relevant, right? So there is now an amendment or a specific allowance for over-the-top providers like Facebook, et cetera, to scan their networks in connection with potential child abuse, right, without getting the consent required under the European e-privacy directive, which requires consent for any storage or access of personal data, right? So the e-privacy directive didn't cover them. The amendment that came out in the law that came out in December put it under scope. And now we are in like barely like April, May, and we have a solution, right? Because it was urgent, because it was important, because the need was great. Well, I mean, I would argue that, we have a good kind of use case that the need is also great for, enforcing and preventing financial crime, especially since, as Jeanette was saying, like this is like data is the new oil, but maybe like financial crime is the new oil also because it leverages data and you can do it in your little home in the pandemic and whatever. So I think, there is a good reason. And I think really the bottom line is we have the, US UK adapter problem. And there is a solution, then we need an adapter. And I think we have a good reason for an adapter, and we just need to do it. I think that without this guidance, what everybody is saying, Jeanette and Sarah and Ronan we're saying it's, you have a law, you need to comply with it. It is really difficult, if not impossible, to comply with it the way it goes now. But everybody knows, right, that that's not the intent. So it's just like you're in technical default and you shouldn't be.
Thank you, Odia. And you did trigger me there. I went to university as a young man in the US, and my plugs just kept falling out of the wall. So I think it's a terrible plug system that you've got there. But going back to topic, and I love your metaphor of finding the adapters. Are there ways in which the legal considerations are perhaps less of a challenge and potentially linked in with the technology if we're talking about specific sharing intra-group, as Sarah and Jeanette talked through, and perhaps bilateral country exchanges rather than talking about the world as a whole? Do you see opportunities there?
So I think, there are the specific, developments in the, deep financial world that I am not well versed in, and Jeanette and Sarah were mentioning. And the global kind of trend of this, it seems to be, so from a US perspective, right, it's never, the intra-country, whatever sharing, and some sharing with affiliates and stuff is allowed right under Gramm-Leach-Bliley and the things that Jeanette were mentioning. Cross-border transfers from the US outside were never a problem. And now, like generally speaking, and now they still aren't a problem, but we're seeing some trends that we need to kind of monitor. There was a couple of things that happened. One is a letter from a few senators to a number of the ad tech companies to try to monitor and understand data sharing in the context of ad tech, specifically going outside of the US. And then there is a bill that was filed by Senator Wyden that basically purports to impose export control like measures on the sharing of certain types of personal data with countries, the data protection regimes of which, you know, could be deemed detrimental to US national security. So that, you know, it's new and it's kind of, you know, it hasn't played out yet, but like this is a trend, a new thing that we haven't seen before, which is there are very, very few cases that I have seen. I've seen it in contracts and insurance company requirements and things like that, but legally that was never a thing. On the other hand, in Europe, right, like the intercompany sharing isn't really the issue. It's more like, is your company in the EU? And then your inter-Euro sharing and the sharing with a select few adequate countries is easier, right? Because you don't have the cross-border thing. You still have, by the way, which I think, you know, the buck doesn't stop there. I think you still have the normal GDPR thing of how do I get over my legal basis? How do I get over my necessity? Is this really compliance with law? Because compliance with law is super difficult to get into because the law needs to be really specific and you go into like the eye of the needle thing. So I don't think the problem ends, but let's say intra-Euro is easy, but then you have like, nobody said Shrem, so I have to, like, we have to say that when talking about transfers, right? So, you know, the Schrems case, right, that people are probably familiar with, right, it makes it really difficult to share data from Europe to other places, like, let's say the US specifically, and other countries that have not been deemed adequate. And then you have like incredibly difficult hoops to jump into, and maybe like you can't even, right? So I think that is something that, I mean, we're still waiting, the way that we're still waiting on the EDPB final guidelines. And I think in this situation, not really the cross-border transfer in this case, right? The use case that we're specifically talking about, which is sharing among financial institutions in connection with the prevention of crime, et cetera. I don't think this is the use case that should be, you know, made more difficult in connection with Schrems. And hopefully, you know, hopefully the people that are the proponents of this agree with that. This is not, you know, the data sharing that we should be worried about. But we need a solution, right? Just like with everything else, right? You have these laws. So forget the endless paperwork that is the data transfer impact assessment that you need to do and investigate the laws of all the states and things like that. But there needs to be something pragmatic that allows this, I think.
Fantastic, and we'll come back to you, Odia, on this point around, you know, what can regulators do? But I want to broaden out that discussion as well, and also leaving time for Q&A. So, you know, from a regulatory perspective, we do see these trends of increasingly strong privacy laws around the world. You know, I think from the export control type of metaphor, it's very emotive data now, and people's sense of insecurity about data, and it's very, you know, appealing for walls to be put up at a national level around data. Sarah, from your perspective, what would you like to see from the regulatory and policy community? You were at the heart of you know, FATF discussions. What would you like to see in terms of engaging with these challenges at that level?
Yeah, thank you. And I have to pick up on Odia's analogy, because I actually think it's actually points out what are the challenges here. So, you know, when it comes to adapters, it's because everybody wants power. The objective is the same. When it comes to data privacy and AML, the objectives are different. And so finding an adapter in that context, when people's objectives are distinct, is foundationally what the issue here is, Nick. So, you know, I was engaged, I mean, almost a decade ago now, in dialogue with FATF, with data privacy experts. And what I learned, which was very important from where I sit, is this huge distinction. So I think what we need is a deep dedication and a willingness on both parts to understand those objectives better. So we need data privacy experts and supervisors and others to understand what the objectives of AML are and what that process is. So, you know, I sat in rooms where people referred to KYC as investigative, police-like investigative work. What KYC is really about us as a business needing to know who our customers are, like foundationally. To me, that's very different. And then on the data privacy, you know, their view of folks like us is that we're willing to give anybody data at any time. You know, I was told that I'd be happy to leave my driver's license out on the side and have anybody go by and pick up my personal data, my PII, which also isn't true. But this just goes to education. And I learned a lot from that, which is that these perspectives. So I think what I would like to see is this engagement to go to a next level. I will also say one of the huge challenges here is AML is not black and white. Fraud is black and white, right? A crime is perpetrated. That is frequently why more information is able to be shared. Our banks take proactive measures. When it comes to AML, it's a level of suspicion. It's not certainty. Your cost benefit is very difficult to calculate. So when it comes to the use case, which I think is fundamental, and Nick, you and I have talked about this a ton in the context of your work, how do we prove that we're all better off because information is shared, if in fact it's not shared in the first instance for us to make that use case? So we have a little bit of a chicken and the egg. So what I would love to see, Nick, is your work and others sort of taken forward over time to be able to say, look, these are the benefits of what can be achieved. And currently it's in the parameters of the environment we're operating in. But can we consider expanding those parameters, derogations around sharing in certain contexts, in order to expand those use cases to allow people to understand the utility and benefit, and more importantly, that this information will not be misused, mishandled, or inappropriately shared.
No, very clear. And I think picking up on some other comments about, when there's the urgency and that clarity on the need, whether it's health or, the power metaphor, people find a way through. But because of the nature of financial crime, there can be, for some people, they don't see the need to act against those failings. And it worries me, because where we have seen that policy reform is only after a big scandal, only after a big crisis or a terror series of attacks. So I hope the policy process can move on evidence, not just scandal. But from your perspective, Jeanette, where do you see the opportunities for regulators to help alleviate pressure here, or help the adoption or understanding of the technical possibilities here?
Well, I think Sarah and Odio were right on point of talking about making sure it's clear under the law, about derogations, about being clear that what kind of sharing can take place for this use case. I also think, especially there in terms of education, our data privacy regulators sometimes miss the opportunity of enhancing and increasing privacy and reducing intrusion by the application of new technology and being able to focus our anti-money laundering efforts, right? And some of that requires data sharing, but sharing does not necessarily mean we're increasing the overall intrusion. John Cusack from the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, gosh, he must get confused with the other John Cusack all the time, but he had a great phrase in his recent speech talking about stopping the screening bycatch, right? And bycatch, for those that don't follow fishing, is the extra stuff fishermen catch in their nets that they didn't mean to get when they're trying to get salmon or whatever specific species it is. Institutions like Sarah and I spend an enormous amount of resource screening out false positives and investigating minor things that have triggered in our alert generation for people that have such limited financial crime risk. Why are we intruding in their privacy and in their history, where we have the opportunity to try and share data and focus our efforts in financial crime on what's having the biggest impact, and also on those that perhaps have acted in a way, if you're a criminal, perhaps you don't have quite the same right to not be intruded against. I know that's a bit controversial, but if we're trying to stop major bribery and corruption, we need to be looking into the activity. So, and I had actually noticed in some of the comments talking about being concerned about de-risking from data sharing. I'm firmly convinced that with the right application of technology, this kind of data sharing is going to reduce de-risking, because we'll be looking at a focused set of customers. We will not be looking at, was a huge trend a few years ago in different parts of industry about, can you serve certain kinds of money services businesses? Is that within your risk tolerance? Being able to really focus and identify the real financial crime risk because that's what we've been able to share information to identify across industry, I think it reduces the impact on others and those possibilities of intruding on others' privacy.
A really important point there, and I think there is evidence, so we're going to be publishing on some of that this year, about the experience of the US 314B legal gateway to actually reduce the propensity to file, to increase the clarity on suspicion, such that actually in some cases resolution is of the nature of reducing risk and propensity to file, which stands to reason. There's a lot of filing just in case without the ability to get answers to some of these questions. Ronan, from a technical perspective, and you talked about the adoption process and the maturity of the debate, what do you want to see from supervisors in terms of understanding this possibility and the capabilities afforded by privacy enhancing technologies?
Yeah, good question, Nick. I think I'll actually turn the question on its head, and I'll try to reframe the problem and use that to answer it. I think actually Sarah touched on this, but I want to share a short anecdote. So I recently had a conversation with the chief data officer of a multinational bank, and he basically told me something that shocked me. Basically said, I have no idea how many customers I have no idea who they are, and I don't think I will ever know because of the cross-border data privacy challenges that my bank is encountering. And this is what really helped me understand the scale of the issue, right? If you don't know something as basic as this, how can you expect to have an effective financial crime program? How can you expect to market effectively? How can you expect to personalize the customer experience and know what products to offer them? There's all these downstream effects, even widening the aperture from financial crime. So, I'll use that to answer your question. What I would love to see from regulators is to be a bit more straightforward on rules of the road, right? Take technology into account more than they have into the past, particularly as related to data privacy issues, and even identify and define priority areas for collaboration and give organizations safe harbor to innovate and to use technology and to share information. And I think Odia said, good candidates for this are public good use cases, right? Stopping fraud, cybercrimes, money laundering, terrorism, even enhancing pharmaceutical and medical research, right? And being able to define these areas and clearly answer what can be shared, under what circumstances, when, and how. It's really that simple, and it can go to solve a huge problem that resides even outside of financial crime, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ronan. And then, back to the legal perspective, Odia, I know you spend most of your time absorbing all of the different ways in which laws perhaps go in different directions. But, if you could seek something from the data protection policy community and the financial crime policy community, what would you be asking for in terms of a policy approach that recognizes these challenges and recognizes the technology?
Yeah, I think Ronan said it correctly. I think that, there needs to be, a couple of things that are happening. Number one, the regulators need to understand what the actual problems are on the ground, as opposed to in the wonderful world of necessary and proportionate that nobody knows what it means, right? So one example for one example of this, and I actually am a member of an organization that submitted comments on this to the EDPB. So the EDPB, for example, the European regulator, held a stakeholders event for last Friday on the interplay between GDPR and data protection and scientific research, right? So in the context of clinical trials, for example, this is also an issue where, because I represent companies in the US, you have US-based companies conducting EU clinical trials and coming up against these data sharing issues with double-blinded, pseudonymized clinical trial data. And they have a problem with legal basis, because the legal basis that you can use for the trial doesn't match the legal basis that you can use for the transfer. And what do you do? And like, those were the points that I said. I said, look, what about us? Like, poor non-EU data controllers that are subject to GDPR, but are not in the EU. So one, I think that the fact that you have like stakeholders events and, and enabling people to say stuff and express problems, I think that's number one, is kind of get aligned with the facts. And then number two, I think get aligned with the interests, maybe maybe is also, right? Like align yourself with the other regulators, not the other privacy regulators, right? Like the financial regulators, and align yourself on a purpose. I think that, I mean, Sarah's right that sort of the purposes are different, but I think that, you know, the Venn diagram where this intersects, which means, you know, we want to prevent crime and protect people, and generally it is in the public good. I think there probably is some educational aspect to it, because I've heard, you know, Schrems-like discussions that put in question the concept of the right and of the United States or whatever to do surveillance. Not like what do you do later with the data, but like the surveillance itself. And okay, like you've got to get aligned on it, but I think that's, you know, surmountable. So that's the second thing is, right, one is get aligned with the facts, two, get aligned with the purposes. And then three, I think there really is, because of the way the laws are right now, there needs to be some sort of specific guidance, right? Like a code of conduct or something that is specific. And maybe the fourth thing, which maybe goes into this code of conduct, is regulators also need to like talk to people that know technology. And then when they put out, so for example, right, and I'm not a technology person, you know, I'm not a, you know, scientist or whatever myself, but when I read through the comments to the EDPB guidelines on Schrems, a disproportionate number of comments said, we have no idea what this encryption thing that you just said was. That's not how we know encryption works, right? And whether or not that's true, right, it's got to be that when you give some guidance on tech, it needs to be something that the tech people can operationalize.
Really helpful. And this has been a fantastic dialogue so far. We're going to open out to take questions from the audience. So please do post your questions, preferably in the Q&A box. And we have a question or a point from Anthony Tarr. He raises that he's aware of FATF work on privacy enhancing technology. There's a current big study under the German presidency which relates to different ways of data pooling is one of the titles of the work, but doesn't necessarily capture the value of privacy enhancing technology, but they are considering privacy enhancing technology. What would stakeholders like to see from that and to support the interaction of technology, data protection and AML requirements? You talked, Sarah, a lot about what FATF had done in the past and convening. What more do you think FATF can do, or who else needs to be part of that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge now is that I think FATF's kind of gone as far as it can. And I'm not saying they couldn't expand the standards. I mean, I advocated for that at the time, to have even the requirements to be more explicit and expanded. But at the end of the day, AML sits here and the data privacy laws sit here. And what I find both in the EU directives and other promulgating regulations globally is that there will be some recognition of data privacy in the context of AML, but data privacy laws don't. There's no reference, there's no provision, there's no derogations around sharing. And so at the end of the day, there's only so much FATF can do in a silo, because the supervisors and the policymakers and institutions like ours who have to meet the regulatory obligations, we are beholden to AML, not data privacy. That's, as well. But what I'm saying is those are the laws that put our requirements in place. So to me, it's always been that we now have to sort of make this shift and to start to see where there is a willingness to start compromising and to find some derogations in whatever form that may be. And Ronan talked about safe harbor. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but we have to move past this place. It's sort of like where I live in a bank, which it's like it's all FCC. It's like it's all AML. It's all FATF. It's like, no, there are other people that we could also bring into this conversation that are also accountable and responsible for where we are. And they need to actually be held accountable as part of this discussion too. And when things don't work and information isn't shared, you can't blame the AML laws and you can't blame AML professionals if there are laws that prohibit that sharing, that sit outside of those.
And Jeanette, I know that you've been involved, and HSBC's been involved, more broadly in that FATF, study that I mentioned. What do you see as the opportunity or the guidance that you would like to see at that top level, and how else can data protection as a community of policymakers and supervisors be encouraged to engage from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think Sarah's spot on. FATF has been really leading the way in trying to overcome and identify this issue. They've done tremendous work in trying to establish what the problem is and give a foundation for why AML data sharing is important. At this point, you know, there's always trends in law and regulatory enforcement, and I think we're on a strong upswing of data privacy and protection around the world. It's evolving at a different pace and in different directions in different places. What I'm seeing, especially in Europe, you know, only a few weeks ago, the European Data Protection Board made a statement talking about whether countries should be considering whether they have to review their international agreements and seeing if data sharing for things like FATCA for the United States and their mutual legal assistance treaties need to be changed to make sure that the information sharing is compliant with GDPR. I think there really does need to be some cross subject matter discussions amongst our data protection teams and our anti-money laundering and regulatory compliance regulators, talking exactly like Sarah was saying about what are the objectives, what are people trying to achieve, what is the current state of technology, what can get done, and really come together to understand how they're impacting each other and how we can try and achieve the best outcomes while respecting what the objectives are in these two different areas. Because I really do think there is a bit of give either way. I mean, I was in the government in the US doing AML work when it was all AML all the time. We don't care about your banking secrecy. So I remember that. And now I'm sitting here looking at some of the data protection laws and being like, oh, wow, that's what that felt like. Okay. So it is an area where I mean, I at least am seeing, I've been involved in a number of different workshops where the ICO from the UK has been there. I think there's a great deal of willingness on the part of many of these regulators, at least in their innovation spheres, to engage in these conversations. But it's always easier to talk about being willing to engage than really being able to get it set up to get those dialogues going. So I know that there are plans to try and move some of that forward when we're allowed to gather again in person. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens over the next year or so in this space.
Really interesting, and you know that sense of the ebb and flow of policy interest and priorities and privacy, you know, clearly on that upswing, you know, really important. Ronan, when you spoke about your kind of asks, you know, there was a lot on the policy side. You know, how much do you think can be done through privacy enhancing technologies, you know, in the absence of that kind of policy change and legal change to provide clear legal bases for specific aspects of information sharing?
I think quite a lot, actually. I mean, we're currently already engaged in projects around AML, around fraud, data monetization, securing data on the cloud. It's all happening, right? And I think, you know, what we like to do is to bring in the appropriate parties, right? Show the regulators, educate the regulators and other stakeholders to see what's possible. Because I think everyone sort of touched upon this, right? You know, there are people that, you know, they know the regulations, they know the law, they know data privacy, but they don't necessarily know the technology. And in our pilots and in working with our clients, we're showing what's possible, right? What's possible in terms of the business benefits, in terms of the efficiency benefits, in terms of the reduction of risk, while still preserving privacy and confidentiality and regulatory compliance. And so I really think that's our approach. I think that's the way to do it, right? You have to bring everyone along. And there's no reason to wait, right? As long as you're collaborative and partnering with all the stakeholders that you need to do it, organizations are doing it now, right? So I think that's what I would offer.
Fantastic, and we've had some comments in the chat which relate to a concern around de-risking and also the importance of public-private dialogue, as well as that broader suite of relevant intelligence coming together and sharing cross-border. You know, unfortunately, obviously, again, these policy trends for the UK, for instance, we've seen as a result of Brexit, we've seen the UK, you know, drop out of the number of information sharing processes. We see a lot of data sovereignty laws strengthening around the world, fear of how data might be used by others, even national security concerns about how data might be used overseas or cross-border. So, are we really on the wrong side of this tide? What's our kind of cause for optimism? A last word around the future, around the panel, about what you're looking for from the future, and any cause for optimism that you see. Odia, do you want to start us off?
Sure, except I'm looking at my notes, and my notes say hold hands and pray, and gets worse before it gets better. So
well, perhaps we're on that wrong side of the tide. Yeah.
No, I think, I spoke at some webinar, and I said that I think that waterproof mascara should be a Shrem supplemental measure, because if we're going to cry, at least like we won't make a mess. But I think that, there has to be a solution, right? Like, we need to prevent crime. This is not like, companies making money off of data or whatever, right? And this is not something nefarious. This is something that everybody knows is a problem. There are, as Ronen said, now solutions that make at least some of the, so we have two things, right? The risk and the plain rules, right? So if you, first of all, the risk we can tackle the risk, right? When you reduce the risk, I think, even though, there's talk about not risk-based approach in connection with Shrems, but I think objectively, one, less risk is less problem. Two, if you can really get around the encryption and the pseudonymization and fall into the space that the EDPB guidelines open up for encryption, that's good. And then the other is there's this discussion of the legal basis, right? Like, can you tweak necessary for, compliance with the law? Can you have some guidance that does that? And because these things, yes, we have rules, but, it's like, when I'm dealing with CCPA and I'm looking at like the fraud exception and things like that, like sometimes you look at a sale and you're like, this should not have been a sale. Like, this shouldn't have been. It's obvious that it shouldn't have been, but they just didn't get to it. I think this is one of those situations, right? It's obvious that it shouldn't be. This is not the issue that we sort of try to legislate against. And so now we just need to find the solution. And I think we will. I think it's, it's a matter of, work. But like I said, with the child abuse, and they did that within 4 months. So it's doable.
Yeah. Fantastic. So we're going to have to go for tweet-sized comments on the optimism of the future. Over to Jeanette and Sarah, and then Catherine's going to close us out.
What Odia said. Yes, basically.
And, you over to you, Sarah. Yep.
No, you can say more, Jeanette.
Especially in terms of clarifying in the law what we are allowed to share under the different data protection laws, and also following on what Ronen had said, harmonizing that across different markets. So I'm not trying to compare different legal standards in translation from 60 different markets would make this much more straightforward.
Thank you, Sarah.
So from an optimism perspective, I think we need to think of this in the context of riding the wave of the global trend of effectiveness and making a better AML regime. I think that outcomes associated with everything we're talking about are what everybody's looking for. It's why the UK did so well, and Jim, that was named in the mutual evaluation. So if there's anything positive, and the most optimistic I can say is this fits so neatly into that basket of deliverables in the context of how we can demonstrate we're doing better in combating financial crime. So we just need to all ride that wave, get on it, put this in that everywhere we go. And Nick, I know you do, because I think that's our best shot.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an absolutely outstanding discussion. Really enjoyed that, and I'm sure our attendees did too. Catherine, over to you to close the session.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more, Nick. This has been really insightful and very interesting, and I'm sure our audiences have enjoyed this talk. So a big thank you to you, Nick, Sarah, Jeanette, Odia, and Ronen on behalf of Duality. There have been a few questions in the chat. Yes, this session has been recorded, and everybody will get the recording sent out. If you have further questions, you can contact us at info@dualitytech.com. And thank you everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.